The second video that we're going to talk about how the government impacts markets is going to be all about how taxes affect markets. Now, governments collect taxes because they need revenue to fund operations. Okay? The manner in which the taxes that are collected impacts the market is known as the markets or the tax incidence. So how does it affect the market? Does this tax tend to affect producers more? Does it tend to affect consumers more? Does it tend to affect both equally? Now, there's one key thing, well, there's several key things, but one really important thing to note about taxes. It doesn't matter who the tax is imposed on. You could tax a consumer, you could tax a producer. Doesn't matter who the tax is imposed on. Both parties end up paying. So, for example, our government collects sales tax from producers. Producers are responsible for collecting the tax and then remitting or sending that money back to the government. All producers do with the sales tax, though, is they add it on to the price of the good that you're actually purchasing, which impacts how much you as a consumer end up paying and how many units you end up buying. So it doesn't matter if a tax is imposed on the buyers in the market or the sellers in the market, both the buyers and the sellers end up paying because taxes distort incentives. Taxes change market outcomes. So, let's suppose that this is a hypothetical market. Let's suppose that currently the equilibrium price is 500 and the equilibrium quantity is 50. Okay? And the government has decided to collect a $300 tax from the sellers. So the government is going to collect $300 in sales tax in this market. To demonstrate how that's going to impact the market, what you do is you simply add $300 to the supply curve. So let's look. So this is going to be at each quantity. So at 30 units, producers were willing, at $300, producers were willing to produce 30 units. Now, instead of $300, it's going to have to be $600. So that's going to be my first point. At 40 units, producers were willing to produce 40 at 400. Now it's going to be 700. At 500, they were willing to produce 50. Now that's going to be 800. At 600, they were willing to produce 60. Now to produce 60, they're going to have to take 900. Okay, and at each quantity, I'm going to add $300. So after the tax is imposed, okay, this is a tax on the sellers of the good, the supply curve is going to shift upward by the amount of the tax. So in this case, $300. And what ends up happening is the price buyers pay is going to increase. So now buyers are paying $700. So buyers are paying more for this product because the government is collecting taxes on it. However, sellers don't get to keep all $700 because they have to return $300 in tax to the government. So sellers end up keeping $400. So the price buyers pay goes up. The price sellers receive as a result of the tax goes down. And the final effect of a tax is the quantity sold decreases. So prior to the tax, 50 units were being sold for a price of $500. After this $300 tax is imposed on sellers, buyers are paying $700, sellers are receiving $400, and 40 units are being sold. So the effect of a tax is to raise the price to buyers, lower the income to sellers, and reduce the quantity sold in the market. So this is a tax on sellers. Now, exact same market. If we were to tax the buyers, what's going to happen is the demand curve is going to shift downward. And it's going to shift downward by the amount of the tax. So at $800, buyers were willing to buy 35. Now at $800, now to buy 35, they're only willing to pay $500. At $700, they were willing to buy 40. Now to buy 40, they're willing to pay $400. At $600, they were willing to buy 45. Now it's at $300. So at each quantity, I'm going to shift the demand curve down. Now, also please note, in this market, I'm actually drawing up and down arrows. So if you remember when we talked about supply and demand, and we talked about shifting curves, we only use left and right arrows. Now you're actually going to want to use up and down arrows. So what's happened in this market is the quantity sold is going to fall to 40. Buyers are only going to be willing to pay $400 to buy 40 units. But they're actually not going to pay $400 because they're going to pay for the product, but then they also have to pay $300 in tax. So the effective price buyers pay ends up being $700, and the price buyers pay always goes up. The effective price sellers receive is going to fall to $400. So buyers end up paying more, sellers end up receiving less, and the quantity sold in the market falls. So if you're paying attention, what happens when we tax a buyer and a seller, doesn't matter who you levy the tax on, the outcome is the same. So we'll look at two more examples. So here the equilibrium price and quantity is $3. So at $3, 100 units are demanded, 100 units are supplied. This will be the black supply and demand curve. Now the government's going to go ahead and impose a 50-cent tax. That's going to go ahead and shift the supply curve. Excuse me, this is a tax on buyers. This is going to shift the demand curve downward by the size of the tax. And this is actually a 40-cent tax, excuse me. Now, what ends up happening is the effective price buyers end up paying goes up. So now buyers are paying $3.20. But sellers don't get to keep all of that. Sellers are only going to get to keep $2.80. So this area represents the money that's going to be actually sent to the government. That's called our tax revenue. We're going to learn more about that later. The second effect is going to be we had been selling 100 units, but now, because of the tax, we're only going to sell 80 units. So let's look at the same tax actually being collected from the producers. When we tax producers, the supply curve this time is going to shift up. So it's going to shift from our black supply curve to our red supply curve. Okay, it's going to shift up by exactly 40 cents. And what's going to happen is the price buyers pay is going to raise to $3.20. The price sellers receive is going to fall to $2.80. The quantity sold is going to decline from 100 to 80. This area will represent tax revenue. This area is called dead weight loss. We're going to learn a lot more about dead weight loss in our next unit and what dead weight loss actually represents. And this red shaded area here represents the money that's actually going to be collected by the government. Now, one more thing we need to look at when we look at taxes is which side of the market does a tax fall more heavily on? Okay? And this is really a function of elasticity. So when a good is taxed, both the buyers and sellers of the good end up paying the tax. But the burden of the tax is always going to fall more heavily on the side of the market that is inelastic. And remember, inelastic is the side that is not responsive. So the price is going to change because of the tax, but whichever side of the market that is, supply or demand, they are not going to be able to respond to that change in price. Okay? So if I have a highly inelastic demand curve and a highly elastic supply curve, the effect is the increase in price to buyers, okay, right here, is going to be significantly larger. So the effect is the increase in price to buyers, right here, is going to be significantly larger than the decrease in price to sellers. So when we have an inelastic demand curve, it's going to be right here. When we have an inelastic demand curve, it falls much, much more heavily on the buyers than on the sellers. So a great example of this is the tax on cigarettes. I would argue cigarettes are going to have relatively inelastic demand because they're physically addictive. So when the government taxes cigarettes, the cigarette manufacturers pay a small portion of that tax, but really that tax falls significantly more heavily on the consumers of cigarettes. Gasoline tax would be another example of this, because gasoline is a necessity. If the government were to raise the tax on gasoline, it would fall much more heavily on the buyers than on the sellers of gasoline. When we have an inelastic supply curve, the opposite effect is true. So when we have an inelastic supply curve, the tax falls much more heavily on the sellers. So here's the effect on my sellers in this blue shaded area. Okay, this is going to be the tax revenue paid out by the sellers. By contrast, because the demand is relatively elastic and the buyers can respond to that change in price, they're not going to have nearly as big a change, or they're not going to pay nearly as much as of that tax. So a great example of this is if you tax luxury goods. Okay? When you tax luxury goods, that tax falls much more heavily on the sellers of luxury goods rather than the consumers of luxury goods. Because people don't have to have luxury goods. So if the tax is too high, they'll simply stop consuming them.